Welcome to the Pro Life Team podcast. I'm Jacob Barr. I'm here with Dr. Joe Malone. And today we're going to be talking about how a young woman's sexual behavior affects her future health. So, Dr. Joe, I'm excited to have you on the Pro Life Team podcast again. For those who haven't heard the previous episodes, would you introduce yourself as if you were talking to a group of pro-life leaders or pregnancy clinic executive directors?
Yeah, I'd be glad to, Jacob, and thanks for having me. I came to the pregnancy care movement probably 3 years ago now, so I'm a newcomer relatively. Came because I'm very interested and really have a background in unwanted pregnancy prevention. So ran a women's wellness program at a university here in Tennessee. And so I learned a lot about the situation from that. But again, they started sharing with me at some point about their really bad experiences with something they called the hookup culture, which caught my attention. And I started realizing that they needed a lot of help in their relationships rather than just their traditional, wellness factors like exercise and nutrition. So my focus shifted to sexual wellness, and particularly young women's sexual wellness. And I ended up getting my PhD specialized in that. So that's how I came to this. Again, for all of you folks out there that are interested in prevention, I'm your guy.
Awesome. Yeah, and thanks for being here. So I'd like to ask you, how does a young woman's sexual behavior affect her future health?
Well, that's a great question, Jacob. And really, that's what the focus, really, the heart of my, I guess you'd call it ministry, my research and my efforts is really all around, because this is one of the main things that brought me into this specialty and into this field, was realizing how this behavior pattern or this lifestyle, this wellness lifestyle that could either be developed or not developed by girls and young women at the younger ages, really has a huge effect on their future health. And what I mean by that is women's reproductive cancers are really a scourge amongst women. I'll get into more of that later. But uh, again, before this research, I didn't realize that so many things that girls and young women can do in their behavior pattern, in their either developing a sexual lifestyle that's wellness oriented or not wellness oriented, and wellness meaning, preventing problems before they happen rather than trying to fix them after they happen. It really make a big difference how they either implemented that or not. And interestingly enough, the behavior pattern really followed, that's the healthy behavior pattern, the healthier, really follows the biblical directives and mandates that, the types of things that we're told in the Bible as far as chastity before marriage and that type of thing. Let me give you some examples, and I'll just walk us through some of the things I'm talking about. I'm going to go to my notes here. Early promiscuity leads to higher chances of vaginal and cervical cancer. So starting from the outside of a woman, young woman's anatomy, being promiscuous, particularly at young ages, leads to much higher chances of vaginal and cervical cancer over her lifetime. Another interesting thing, none or minimal number of pregnancies and none or minimal breastfeeding over her lifetime raises her lifetime chances of developing ovarian and uterine cancer. And again, I'll get into the reasons for these later. So again, working inside of her now, again, the idea of getting married younger, starting to have children, young babies younger, breastfeeding them, all the things that happen naturally before we had artificial birth control, especially, and before our young people started delaying getting married and starting to have children so much, has really affected, again, the women's future reproductive cancer chances. It's going on. Delayed childbearing. So that means, again, like what we're having now with our young women, a lot of them being over 30 when they're starting to have their children. Delayed childbearing and fewer pregnancies, so smaller number of children in the family, raise the risk of the lifetime development of breast cancer. And breast cancer is becoming outrageous as far as the rate. Get into that more in a little bit here. So here's a really interesting one. A woman who has her first child around the age of 20 has half the chance of developing breast cancer as a woman who has her first child around the age of 30. So I'll say that again one more time. A young woman who has her first child around the age of 20, again, presumably she's getting married and starting to have her children, along the lines of in earlier years, kind of more the normal ages. Around the age of 20 has half the chance of developing breast cancer as the woman who has her first child around the age of 30. So
Mm.
we're getting a lot of young women who, are just starting to even think about having children around, they're just getting to the point where they're trying to find a marriage partner at around age 30. And if, they may take them longer than they think to get married, and then they start trying to have children. And of course, infertility starts, peeking its ugly head at that point. And I'll get into that more later, but let's stick with the promiscuity. Another, which is again, a big part of my work, is trying to promote sexual integrity. Again, particularly among women, because again, that's my background, but also women are much more at risk for all these things than the men are. So a study in 2020 out of UK that had over 5,000 people part of it, found that women with 10 sexual partners or more lifetime have a 91% greater chance of being diagnosed with cancer than ones who have one or zero as far as premarital sexual partners. So once again, it became clear to me in my research that the traditional approach, the biblical approach, is not only right ethically, but it's also right scientifically and medically. Let me go on a few other points here, and then I'll stop and see if all this makes sense. Breast cancer, as I said earlier, has become a scourge in our society. It's the number one most, I guess you'd say, diagnosed cancer in the world. It became that in the end of 2020, surpassing lung cancer. And again, only 99% of the people that get breast cancer are women. So we're talking about basically one whole side of the population that's really having this really hit them hard, whereas only again 1% of men end up getting breast cancer. So it goes along with this change in lifestyle pattern from the 50s, maybe 60s, early 60s back, where in 1960 only 5% of the population, 5% of the births were being born out of wedlock. So almost everybody was getting married, and the percentages I don't have in front of me right now, but they were very high for 18 and over being married, and that type of thing. So that normal pattern of marriage, starting to have children younger. Again, a woman's peak fertility is from age 19 to 29, and then a man's is from 24 to 26. But breast cancer has become, like I said, a scourge. And the bad news on that is that it's much more deadly than the cancers that men get, for instance, reproductive cancers like prostate cancer. Um, the numbers are about the same for prostate and breast cancer as far as the numbers that people are getting them, males and females. But even though they're about the same, women's mortality rate with it is 45% more likely to die from the disease. So these are serious, serious issues for women as they age. And most of those are most of the breast cancer deaths are from about 40 to about 60. So it's not older women in most cases. It's middle age, or what some people would consider younger. Another factor is that women have twice as many different places that they can get, different sites that they can get reproductive cancers. There's actually 6 of them: cervical, ovarian, uterine, vaginal, vulvar, and breast cancer. Whereas men can only get it in 3 places: testicular, penile, and prostate. So things are set up as far as women holding the bag, so to speak, on promiscuous sex or casual sex or hookup culture or whatever you want to call it. So um, what I'm trying to advise and educate young women particularly on is that this isn't casual. There's nothing casual about it, and there's nothing that is probably rewarding, other than the momentary feeling of having experienced it. But there are so many downsides, and there's so many reasons that not to do it. Our society, Jacob, now has 100 times more breast cancer than our ancestral society did. So there's a number of factors in addition to what I've just mentioned, but let me just give them to you real quick here. In ancestral societies, the women, again, where they were naturally cycling, they were getting to menstruation later because they're more active and had less body fat, which is a factor in our girls developing, their periods for earlier. But they're coming to menstruation later, let's say 18, 19, and is regularizing about that around that time period. They were getting married around 20, 21. Well, actually, a lot of the women were getting married in their late teens. And so they were hitting that sweet spot as far as 19 to 29 being the peak fertility. And again, I believe God gives us messages through these things as far as, um, the natural pattern. There's a message for us there to follow it. So um, and again, the other factors that are involved in that is they were pregnant much more than our women are these days. So in our society, because of hormonal birth control, because of other methods of preventing pregnancy, the women on average have, well, I'll give it to you, the ancestors first. The ancestors had only about 160 cycles in their reproductive life, and what meaning that they're pregnant or breastfeeding on demand, and the breastfeeding on demand keeps their cycle from starting. So the natural way of being for women in our past, which is a long time, a lot of generations before us, was this: once you reach reproductive age and you get married, again, marriage was much more common than it is now. Then the baby making stage was something that this went on throughout their reproductive life. But a lot of people would look at that today and say, "Oh, that's horrible. It's terrible. Women didn't have a chance to be, astronauts or lawyers or doctors or whatever." And I agree that that's important, that women have the opportunity to develop whatever they truly want to be. But this whole factor of trying to ignore the way things have been for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations before us um, is really foolish, I believe. So um, what happens is every time they have a cycle, and again, we're getting, the ancestors had about 160. Our women are getting around 450 in their lifetime. So every time that they have a cycle, the cells in their ovaries, first of all, a egg, when it comes to maturation, when it gets ripe, the one that is the one for that time, it rips the ovary wall basically and leaves a scar. And so um, that process leads to a greater chance of cancer. Also, in the woman's breasts, every time there is um, a cycle, a period, um, her breast tissue changes over. And so every time we have those higher levels of cell changes, you raise the chances of a cancer developing. So that's probably one of the major factors right there. Other than all the other things I've named, as far as the promiscuity and the lower number of births and not breastfeeding and that type of thing, that the fact that they're having so many more menstrual
Hmm.
cycles is a huge factor in it. So all that said, I'm gonna stop and see if you have thoughts or questions. All that said, it's been a very unhealthy direction we've gone with our women. One other quick thing for you to note, that, and we'll get into how, if you want, how abortion affects all of this as well, because I want to save that for kind of later in our talk. Um, in 1973, when Roe versus Wade was the ruling was made, only about 1 in 1,000 women were getting breast cancer, if you can believe that. You have any idea what the percentage is now of women getting breast
I don't
cancer?
know.
It was 1 in 1,000. Yeah, it was 1 in 1,000 in 1973. It's now 1 in 8.
Oh wow.
So it's gone from 1 in 1,000 in that much time, in that short of a time period. So, so anyway, I'll stop there. And if,
Yeah.
are there any thoughts or questions you have on any of that?
I do have a question. So, what's the difference between well, I have a couple of questions. One is, it's really interesting that the number of cycles is relevant and that being pregnant and breastfeeding reduces the number of cycles, which is reducing the impact of those cycles by, yeah, through natural processes of breastfeeding. So one question I have, and saving the abortion topic for a little bit down the road here. What's the difference between
Yeah.
breastfeeding versus formula? How does formula impact a woman's body and breastfeeding and cycles? So, like, if she decides to use formula instead of breastfeeding, what's yeah? Can you talk about that scenario?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. Um, Not only humans, but most other mammalian species have the same mechanism that when the female is lactating, and milk is being produced, and they're breastfeeding on demand, where that infant, or in our case infant, but baby animal of some other type, is coming and suckling on uh, their nipple, and that process, there's a whole chemical process that tells their ovulation system to stay shut down. It only lets off when that I guess you'd say that phenomenon that they're experiencing with the breastfeeding on demand goes away. Now, a lot of women have this, and so they remain infertile, and that's again not just us, but most other mammals. It's the same kind of system. So it seems to be, in my opinion, it seems to be a system that God has put into us that is natural, as far as when you have a really small baby, and again, going back into our ancestral times, which has been most of the time that humans have been here. If you had that situation where you just had the baby and you were breastfeeding, and then you got pregnant right away on top of it, first of all, the woman's body isn't ready for that after going through that. But secondly, it would be tough to be able to support a pregnancy plus like a 3 or 4 month old infant at the same time. So to me, it's a wondrous system that God put into us. Not only us, but again, many, maybe most of all of the other mammalian species. So um, with infant formula, again, you're not getting that interaction and that chemical process. When a baby suckles on his or her mother's breast, a bunch of oxytocin is released. And again, oxytocin, there's something called prolactin. Again, the pro and lactating, and prolactin particularly is an anti-libido, anti-testosterone and estrogen hormone, because again, as long as it's strongly present in the system, the her cycle's not going to kick back into gear. An example of in the wild, in other species, an unfortunate example how this is kind of circumvented, is with some species of, let's say bear, or say maybe orangutan or something along that, chimpanzee. um not chimpanzee, because they're promiscuous. um, but species that aren't so promiscuous, if there's a new alpha male um, that defeats the old alpha male uh, coming about in the relationship, oftentimes the new alpha male will kill the young, if there's young, like suckling type young of, let's say, the bear, and that will bring back the female bear back into heat, into estrus. But otherwise, she won't go into estrus until that time where the bear cub gets weaned. So, and how wild animals know that and know to do that, I have no idea. But again, this is a really, really deep system that has been with us for a long, long time. And again, with the way society has become, where we can just kind of walk away from that, create infant formula, and you know, circumvent that system, that's where you do get sometimes these pregnancies, because when there isn't on-demand breastfeeding, as I'm sure you know, and your listeners know, if it isn't on demand, then the woman's going to have a tendency to go back into normal sexual cycling and become fertile again. So anyway, all that said, back in times, in most of our history, times that were rougher as far as survival goes, these systems we're talking about were wondrous as far as keeping things on the right track to be able to produce a healthy family, a large healthy family, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So out of all these different cancers, which is the most likely? Is it breast cancer the most likely one for a woman to be at risk with in these scenarios? Or yeah, which how would you compare the different cancers?
It is now, yes. It's a leading female reproductive cancer, leading as far as numbers go. The most deadly one still, though, is the ovarian cancer. Again, those excess numbers of menstrual cycles, where again, every time. Let me give you the background on that. All females, all human females are they start out with about 7 million eggs, in utero, in their mother's womb, and by the time they're born, it's down to about 1.5 million. It's a process of starting with all these eggs for their whole lifetime. This is their lifetime supply, and the degradation of them over their lifetime. So 1.5 million when they're born. By the time they get to puberty, where they can actually use them, they're down to about 400,000, 3 to 400,000, and then there's several thousand each time they each time they menstruate that are degraded. And there's only one that's chosen to become the follicle to ripen and burst, and then it makes its way down the fallopian tubes, and the rest of the process. Um, and so the rip though that happens there again, these eggs are getting older by the day as far as their age, as far as things, as far as raising the chances of uh, chromosomal abnormalities or not. And again, the younger, the better on that. Um, but also that ripping of the ovary and its scarring is also raising the chances of ovarian cancer. And ovarian cancer is so deadly mostly because you don't find out about it until it's too late. It doesn't show symptoms until it's too late. So that's a really scary one for women. On the other hand, to compare to the other sex, again, this is, I think, very interesting, and probably most of the people may know this, but the women's side of things is a limited supply. And by the way, the egg cell is like 10 million times larger than the sperm cell. The egg cell is the largest cell in the human body, and the sperm cell is the smallest cell in the human body, because the egg cell is carrying with it a ton of nutrition
Hmm.
to be able to get the pregnancy started once the union is started. But on the male side of things, so there's a ton of these sperm, as you probably know already, that's being produced, like 2 to 300, high 300 million sperm in one ejaculate, and it's being replaced at once that happens at 2,000 sperm a second. So 2,000 sperm a second are being manufactured by us males once that takes place. So it's kind of like a conveyor belt. So even though there is some factor to males aging as well, because older male sperm has a higher chance of producing chromosomal abnormalities as well, but not nearly the same as females, because over age 30 it really starts to rise as far as their again, their eggs have been, they're as old as they are plus 6 months, 6 7 months. So the sperm that the men are producing are freshly made, basically, even if the man is older. So there's a much lower chance that his age is going to be a factor on Down syndrome and things like that, or a stillbirth, or premature birth, or Down, yeah, I already said Down syndrome. There's one other that I'm not thinking of right now, but it's like being miscarriage. So the woman's age is a huge factor, and most women don't realize, and kind of our society does a bad job about this, that 30 is really starting to get, it's getting late in the game. So um, that we have a whole issue, as I know Jacob, because I think we discussed it last time, of, they call it population collapse, or demographic collapse, or and basically the idea is that people around the world in the developed countries are having less and less children, and because of that, the numbers of older people, aging people, are really growing, and the ages of young people, babies first of all, and then up into their really working life age, is really declining. So, for instance, South Korea is at zero point 0.7. You have to have 2.1, to replace the population. They're at zero point 0.7, and what they're projecting is that, well, actually, the present case is that for every people that are of grandparent age over there, every 100 grandparents, there's only 4 grandkids.
Hmm.
So we're looking at, in South Korea, you're looking at, and if you, even if you start, right away, trying to have more babies, you've got a 20-year lag time there before they get up to where they're, able to be the kind of productive people of society that we need them to be. So if you can see, and that is very common. The only places in the world that don't have declining and non-replacing birth rates is sub-Saharan Africa, and they're going that direction as well. They're starting to go that direction as well. So it's rather than the population bomb that the book in the 1960s was putting fear in people's minds about too many people on the planet, we're ending up with not enough people, and particularly the ones that we need the most, which are the ones that are the young ones that are going to be able to replace all of the older generations. So
Hmm.
again, that's a lot of information there, but it's important information, and it's information that most people don't know. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for explaining that. Well, I sort of I'm very well interested in going into this next section to talk about abortion, and I'm sort of wondering what are the
Mhm.
different classifications. So like there's women who have never been pregnant, those who have been pregnant and breastfed, those who have been pregnant and decided to use formula, so their breastfeeding was short lived, and then there's also those who got pregnant and then ended up having an abortion at different stages in the pregnancy that's going to impact
Mhm.
their their breasts getting partially prepared for breastfeeding, but maybe not. Yeah. So tell me, like, what are the different stages of, when it comes to the different scenarios? Then maybe you can expand on the ones that seem to be most helpful.
Okay, another excellent question. It's hard to parse that out exactly, but what I would say to the majority of your early part of your question is, you know, again, within reason, the younger a woman can get married, and I emphasize marriage, and marriage then childbearing. A lot of cases that doesn't work out that way either, but marriage, and we can maybe talk about this in another episode. But marriage really just acts in such a positive way to be secure, add to the security, particularly of the woman, that it's got many positive factors to it. But so let's presume earlier marriage. Let's presume somewhere around 20, and then pregnancy soon thereafter, maybe 21, 22. Again, doing that, uh, choosing not to bottle feed but breastfeed, and then not too long after that, maybe 3 years, 3 years total, maybe start having another child, and then that process for 3 years, breastfeeding for those. a lot of that 3 years of time in between, and then doing it again. All of those things again, really, really. Let's put it this way: starting earlier, having babies, again, presuming being married, having many babies, breastfeeding them, all of those things are extremely positive. You take out any of that combination, and you start raising breast, particularly breast cancer, but then all the other cancers I mentioned, cervical, vaginal, ovarian, uterine, and endometrial. All those are raised by not following that traditional pattern. A big one though is that is the numbers. Having lower numbers is a big risk factor, and then of course breastfeeding kind of goes along with that. But the age of having your first baby. Now this is important for women to hear, and girls even to hear, because a girl or woman who has her first baby around 20, let's say even right at 20, let's say she was pregnant at 19, has half the chance, as I said probably earlier, has half the chance of developing breast cancer as a woman that's 30 or greater, having her first child
Hmm.
around 30. So having that first child earlier is a huge factor. Um, a woman that has several babies over the course of reproductive life, again, has a lower chance of particularly breast cancer. But a woman who waits till after 30 to have her first one, this is kind of a crazy statistic, but a woman who waits till after 30 to have her first baby, her first full term, pregnancy and baby, actually has a higher chance than a woman who never has babies at all. So being pregnant over 30 with your first baby, there's something about that is, it goes against the natural system of the body. So again, looking back in our history to our ancestors, pre 1845, and this is news to a lot of people too, but the hormonal birth control, invented in 1960, that's famous, and it had a big impact. But if you look at fertility rates, birth rates, historically, let's just take the United States. Well, you could take many countries in the world because the charts kind of show similar things in the different countries, but especially in the United States, after about 1845, birth rates start going down. Okay, it was like around seven children per average per woman, and it starts heading down on a pretty steep decline. And it has a couple of jumps because of the wars, like World War II. It jumps up after World War II, and then the baby boom generation, and it's continued on down from there. Most people don't realize that in 1845, Goodyear, yeah, the tire company, got a patent for vulcanizing rubber. And so from 1845-ish on, the condom invention really came about kind of mid 1800s. Uh, so that made a big difference as far as being able to prevent births as well, going from 7 down to what it is now, less than 2. So it wasn't just the hormonal birth control, although that has been a big factor. And we could have a whole other talk about the harms of hormonal birth control on women as well, but they will save that for another day. So there's all of that, plus abortion. Again, abortions didn't become overall legal until 1973, and we said that women's chances of developing cancer in 1973, before Roe versus Wade, were 1 in 1,000. Now the chances of developing breast cancer is 1 in 8 in a woman's lifetime. So not just our ancestral, as we think of way back when, which is again 100, they were 100 times less likely, but you got this 1 in 1,000 in 1973, and then now it's 1 in 8. So if you want to, we can talk about how abortion has affected it.
Yeah, I think that would be good to to talk
Is
about
that a
how abortion impacts the woman's body. Um, and maybe in contrast to a pregnancy when someone's in that 20 to 29-year-old window and breastfeeding.
Mhm.
That does sound like that would be good to
Well,
explore.
again, yeah, if you think about it, Jacob, everything artificial we've been talking about, everything isn't natural, from the process of, again, getting married and starting to have babies, the natural way, just as it happens. Everything that goes away, and then breastfeeding them and having however many kind of God gives us, everything that goes away from that raises cancer risk for a woman. But in particular, I think, and again, this has been politically, a political football, as you know, and a lot of our listeners will know, for a long time. But and there's been a lot of people trying to say that abortion doesn't have anything to do with risk of cancer, reproductive cancers for women. But I think there's too much evidence, going the other way. So and the other thing is, since '73, again, the 1 in 1,000 chance of breast cancer and for a woman, and now the 1 in 8. That's a short amount of time, relatively, for that kind of a change to happen. So basically, on abortion, the situation is that process, that natural process of becoming pregnant, carrying the pregnancy, giving birth, and then breastfeeding in most cases, that's interrupted. And it's really, it surprised me when I saw this research, but it's all the way up to 32 weeks, which of course would be 8 months. So the pregnancies that are aborted up to 32 weeks, which would be almost all of them, have this effect of interrupting this natural cycle of the breast tissue changing through, again, the whole process of the prolactin being increased in their bodies and other hormones falling. There's a natural process that seems to be in place where the breasts, over the course of the pregnancy, while the baby's in utero, uh, change their cells to cancer resistant cells, more cancer resistant cells. And so if you interrupt that process, again, all these are natural processes that we're interrupting by, man-made artificial means. When you interrupt that process, they don't become the cancer resistant cells that they would have been. And again, particularly if the woman has her first baby, closer to 20 and not so close to 30. The process seems to really be messed up if she waits, to have the baby. If if she doesn't abort the first baby and she aborts some of the subsequent babies, is not as much effect as well. So it's aborting the baby, particularly a first pregnancy, which is probably statistically, I don't have the stats on this, but you or some of your listeners probably do, probably much more likely that the first baby would be aborted than later babies. That's really the most dangerous one as far as starting this anti-protective process. So there's a automatic prevention process cellularly and biochemically in a woman's body if she's generally following the natural process of having a baby and probably having it, again, pre 20 age 25, as opposed to post 30, and that type of thing. And again, if she carries out the process, the pregnancy process, there's this automatic change in her breast cells to make them cancer resistant, as opposed to the ones where the pregnancy is interrupted. So that's something that they don't want young women to know, because again, it's supposed to be all about their health and well-being, the women who are having the abortions. But this is one other factor, and because there's been such a resistance and a unwillingness to research this strongly, uh, there's a ton, I think, of research on it that is showing that's the case. Um, so that the lesson there is, you break the process that God has put in place that radically, and again, there's going to be a price to be paid for it, probably down the line. Now, all of these, for any of your listeners that are listening and might be getting scared, from this, these are just raised percentages, as far as nobody for sure is going to for sure get cancer. No woman listening to this that didn't breastfeed her babies, had her first baby, at 35. There's going to be exceptions to all these rules. It's just that you don't want to necessarily raise your chances and your risk of it if you don't have to. Plus, again, that more natural lifestyle, that getting married younger, having babies younger, um, again, speaks to and addresses the issue of the demographic collapse. But it also, having more babies helps your children to have the social group that humans have generally grown up with in the past, where they have several siblings. And there's the effects of having just one or two children, one in many cases, on a child, in their future, haven't been really researched well. But my feeling is that it won't be positive as compared to having three or four, siblings, as was common, or even more in the past. My grandfather was a child. There was eight of them, eight siblings in the family. So, and that, again, that was very common. So that's just back two generations from me. So when I look at things, Jacob, this has been my experience in my life, personally, my personal experience, but then even more so in my research, that any time we go away from the natural lifestyle. So natural lifestyle I've been describing, pre condoms, pre hormonal birth control, and more to the Catholic idea of, marriage is about unitive and procreative and being open to life and that type of thing. That is more the natural, I think, human way, and the natural way that God intended for things for things to be for us. And there are health rewards to that, I guess, is what I'm saying. It's what I've observed. So, any other questions or thoughts on that?
Um, so the opposition, or the abortion industry, Planned Parenthood, certain people
Hmm.
essentially say that abortion does not contribute towards breast cancer, and there's a very strong narrative that anyone who says there's a link between abortion and breast cancer is pushing an agenda. Meanwhile, there's also the AACR journal. It's a medical journal that's published um, a medical study that shows that abortion increases the risk factor of breast cancer. Um, yeah, so essentially, one side is saying the pro-abortion side essentially is saying that it's not open for debate. It's closed. It's not worth looking at. This is all essentially saying that we're not even in discussions. Meanwhile, we're saying the opposite, I suppose. That it's connected. We have scientific evidence. There's data. There's studies. And so by putting those two together, it's obviously not a closed debate, but one side doesn't even want to debate or talk about it. And so that's been my experience, is that they're essentially saying, this is no longer a discussion, essentially just trying to silence the opposition by saying that the opposition doesn't really exist, I suppose, or that there is no discussion to have. What have you seen when it comes to data
Right.
and that connection between abortion and breast cancer?
Well, same as you. Again, the political climate that we're going through right now, any anything that goes against the narrative that the mainstream media and just general the power elites in the country are trying to put across is not met with a fair discussion, or a fair hearing. So, and right off the bat, what you're describing there, makes my sense of there's something wrong here go up. But uh, to add to the group that you mentioned, there's also a real responsible group called the American College of Pediatricians. So the American College of Pediatricians. There's another group of pediatricians that have a different name that I can't bring to mind, but they would be along the lines of what you've been describing. There's nothing to see here. The research is inconclusive and that type of thing. And so, in addition to that there's a very reputable group of the American College of Pediatricians who's done research, some of the research that I was citing about the pre 32 weeks adverse effects, and the fact that some of the other research that they've observed, they've noticed that it's been cherry picked, and the data that they've seen being used by these other groups um, hasn't actually been scientific. It hasn't been actually fairly weighed in the long run. So, like so many things, I think in our society right now, there's a very skewed picture coming at us from so many different angles, and so many different around sexuality, especially so many elements of sexuality, I think, that have inaccurate science that's being professed. And again, my experience is that in the more legitimate research studies, the last 10 years maybe or so, a lot of it hasn't gotten funded because, again, there's a political, I think, bent to what gets funded right now and what doesn't. So, and again, the people who fund, sometimes if it's not government funding, then the private entities that fund it, they're looking for a particular outcome as well. So to answer your question, I think there's reputable people that are adding abortion as a risk factor into that whole line of risk factors that I've explained up to this point, all of which are unnatural. I mean, when you look at it, they all have that in common. They're unnatural from the pattern of the past. So, I think that we've been kind of lulled into sleep on all this. Maybe not about abortion, but the rest of it, as far as my wife and I came up during the time where they said, okay, 2 children. You want to have two children. You want to use hormonal birth control. That's the smart thing to do. You can be rich. If everybody should be able to be rich in America if they just have limited 2 children. And besides, your women it's bad for them to have more than 2 children. Bad for them, ruins their bodies, makes them unhealthy, that type of thing. And I literally, as a fitness professional, I experienced the opposite, because I had these. This is just empirical. This is empirical, yeah, but it's also anecdotal. But it goes along with what we're talking about. I had the 2 healthiest women I ever trained as a personal trainer that were in their 40s to early 50s. Each had 8 kids, and again, this is in the 1990s, early 2000s, and I was still thinking along the lines of more than 2 kids for a woman ruins them, ruins their body, ruins their health. Well, it was quite a lesson for me in that I had one that was a Catholic. She had 8 children, and the other one was a Mormon that had eight children. And actually, they were a lot healthier than a lot of the women that I was training that were in their 20s. So I realized right then, anecdotally, that this urban myth, of going around about women in our society, being ruined if they have more than 2 children. Boy, is that off, with these ladies. So they were just perfect examples of that. So now, again, you look back in your family history for one thing, you see I can picture my little grandmother, great grandmother, I guess, because she's the mother of my grandfather. This little woman with like these 8 kids surrounding her, and she looks as prim and proper as as you could imagine. She's in great shape. She's a little woman. She's not carrying extra fat. Like they're so common these days. She isn't struggling with obesity. And I think just what I've observed in my work, as you can tell, but then also in the research, is that putting women's bodies through this cycle is really, really healthy for them. Getting pregnant, running through the cycle, breastfeeding, then getting pregnant, maybe 3 years time lapsing between the two. It's kind of what women's bodies were. I mean, not kind of. I mean, as you start thinking about it, women's bodies are made for this. So at least most of them. So when you don't do it, when you don't follow that pattern, when you radically change it, and probably abortion is the most radical change of all of it, you're asking for trouble. You're asking for trouble in most cases. Not every case. There's going to be women that go through this and have, they don't do any things that we said that are positive. They have an abortion, and they're not going to ever they're never going to develop any reproductive cancers. But there's going to be a lot more that do. There's going to be on a population basis, there's going to be a lot more that do, and by raising the risks by their behavior, I call it young women's wellness lifestyle. What's your wellness lifestyle, young women? And being told like they're being told on the college campuses these days, and through society, TikTok, whatever you want to name, that casual sex, for one thing, is good for you, and all you got to do is. I ran into some down in one of the universities I was at, that their philosophy was, living a casual sex lifestyle, a hookup lifestyle, and then they were good. They're going to be good health practitioners, take care of the health, but they're going to get checked, for STDs every, I think, 2 months, 2 to 3 months at this sexual wellness center that I happen to be giving, talks at and that type of thing. And the sexual wellness center was, there are people like us that realize that isn't the lifestyle that you want to have, but they were able to, these folks in the pregnancy help movement were able to, who were running this, were able to reach out to these young women and have some conversations with them and talk with them. And so on one hand, it's good they were thinking that way because they're coming into these centers, these sexual wellness centers. On the other hand, again, the thought process that they've been taught to be going to them, to think that this is the thing they need to do to have a healthy sexual wellness, practice sexual wellness habits. They're way far off on that. So in our society, we've gone so far off the rails, especially when it comes to young women's lifestyle, and particularly their relational or sexual lifestyle, that we've got a long way to come back. And I think that is an admirable, if you're listening to me out there, pregnancy center director, you maybe have one of these sexual wellness centers, and maybe you're near a college campus, a university campus, and that's all on purpose. That's a wise move. And I'm a guy that can come and help you with your staff to learn a lot about sexuality, heterosexuality, that will help them to counsel, these young women that they're dealing with. So it's a wise approach. And there's these young women, again, particularly the ones that are, they see themselves as being, responsible and being having good sexual wellness habits by doing this check, but still, living the active casual sexual life. But since that's where they're at, and that's the lifestyle that they're in, I think this approach of having a pregnancy help center that may be right on the campus or very near the campus, that is for the actual, when they're already pregnant, and dealing with that situation of trying to help them not to make the decision to have an abortion, but then having this other preventive branch, this sexual wellness center or sexual health center, that really doesn't say anything about, abortion or anything like that. I think that's a wise move these days, but it's also kind of sad that we have to have that we've come to that point.
Well,
so,
yeah, I really appreciate you sharing this insight on just the benefits of living certain, having certain behaviors, living a certain, having certain sexual integrity, keeping sex within marriage, limiting certain behaviors or restraining them to be within marriage, and how that impacts someone's health, someone's long-term health, or avoiding cancers.
Our sponsors include Heritage House, Patriot Insurance, and iRapture.com.
The Pro-Life Team podcast is a ministry of iRapture.com.
If you would like to explore making a donation or becoming a sponsor, or have a recommendation for who would be a good guest on the podcast, please contact us at hello@prolife.team.
Shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green. He leads me by quiet blue. Yeah, direction and guidance are comforting me everywhere that I go. Spread a feast before me in the presence of my enemies, in front of my accusers, you're enjoying me. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup is overflowing mercy, beauty, and your love are chasing after me everywhere that I go, every day of my life, everywhere I go, every day of my life. You refresh and restore my soul. You lead me in righteous pathways for your name's sake alone. You've invited me to make your house my home. I will be no